At 6:12 a.m., rain came down in thin, slanting needles that found every gap in Grace Chen's coat and worked their way to skin. She stood across from Family Court on Lafayette Street with her cracked briefcase tucked under one arm, her phone at 12%, and a paper cup of coffee gone cold enough to taste metallic. Water had seeped through the sole of her right drugstore heel, and each shift of weight sent a chill up her calf and into her spine. She checked her bank app again, even though she knew the number by heart. $38.14 in checking. Savings, empty. Card 1, maxed. Card 2, maxed. Rent due in 9 days. She closed the app, opened it once more, and stared until the screen dimmed. She had worked 3 double shifts in a row at the translation desk, moving from arraignment to custody hearings to emergency protection orders, her voice switching between English and Mandarin until words stopped feeling like meaning and started feeling like muscle strain. At 2:07 a.m., she had fallen asleep at her kitchen table with legal pads spread under her cheek and woken at 4:39 to the sound of her upstairs radiator knocking like a fist against old pipes. She had showered in water that never got fully warm, pinned back hair still damp at the roots, and printed one last copy of her subpoena at the corner bodega because her own printer had died 2 months ago, and she still could not afford ink, much less replacement parts. By the time the train doors opened downtown, her hands were already trembling from caffeine and empty calories. In the outer pocket of her briefcase, under a stack of translated invoices and transit receipts, the subpoena rode in a plastic sleeve to protect it from rain. The heading carried federal language in heavy type, stark and indifferent. Her name sat in the center as if it belonged to someone with more sleep, more money, and a safer life. She had read that page so many times she could recite the legal penalties for failure to appear. But the line that kept tightening her throat was the witness section, where Victor Sava's counsel would be present for cross-examination. She knew his public face from magazine profiles and gala photographs. Immaculate suits, polished shoes, hand on someone's shoulder, smile calibrated to cameras. She also knew his private ecosystem from translation logs, shell company registries, and the pleading calls she used to field when women asked if hospitality contracts could be voided after their passports vanished. She had never forgotten how quickly his network found pressure points. A bus exhaled at the curb and sprayed gray water over the hem of her slacks. Grace stepped back under the courthouse awning where 2 junior associates in tailored wool coats scanned emails without looking up. Their umbrellas were black and unblemished, the kind that opened in a clean arc and never turned inside out. Grace's had broken in October, and she had kept meaning to buy another. Instead, she had tied her file folders in plastic and accepted getting soaked. She could smell wet concrete, diesel, and the bitter roast from the cart near the corner. Her stomach cramped once, then settled into the hollow ache she had learned to ignore during long shifts. Breakfast had been half a protein bar from her coat pocket, softened by humidity and lint. At 6:21, her phone buzzed with another unknown number. She let it ring out, then listened to the voicemail transcription populate in uneven text. No words, only breathing and a click. She deleted it without replaying. The previous week had brought 5 calls like that, always from different numbers, always between midnight and dawn. She had reported each one through the proper channels and received the same procedural response. Document, preserve, forward. She had complied. There was a folder on her desktop labeled Contact Log, with timestamps, screenshots, and a discipline that looked strong on paper. On the sidewalk, discipline felt thinner. She crossed the threshold with the first wave of court staff at 6:32. Warm air met rain-soaked fabric, and for one dizzy second she swayed. The lobby rose in pale marble and brushed steel, a space designed to look permanent and controlled. But even here, everything smelled faintly of wet wool and printer toner. Her shoes clicked unevenly on the floor. Security recognized her badge from prior assignments and waved her through with a sympathetic nod. But at clerk intake, a young man in a pressed shirt took her documents and frowned at her interpreter's certification card as if seeing one for the first time. "You're testifying as fact witness, not language support today," he said without looking at her. "You understand that distinction?" "I do." He turned the card over anyway. "Your accent on the record may raise clarification issues." She held his gaze. "My credentials are current. My testimony is in English. If the court requires clarification, I will provide it." A woman behind her in line shifted impatiently. A camera lens from the press area lifted, then dropped when nothing dramatic happened. The clerk stamped 3 forms and slid them back. "Courtroom 4B. Check in with marshals. Don't wander. Don't wander." As if she were a tourist who might drift into the wrong museum wing. Grace gathered her papers with careful fingers because when she rushed, she dropped things. And when she dropped things, people looked at her with that practiced mixture of annoyance and dismissal she had known since childhood. She had trained herself to move precisely even when exhaustion made edges blur. The corridor to 4B was lined with benches where lawyers arranged files in tight stacks and witnesses stared at their own shoes. Grace took the farthest seat near a radiator that hissed but gave little heat. She opened her legal pad to the index she had built over 7 weeks. Dates, company aliases, transfer amounts, warehouse references, call signs, corrected spellings. The entries were color-coded with highlighters gone dry at the tips. She had memorized most of it, but she still traced each line with her pen to steady her breathing. When she reached the notation for Pier 39 loading manifests, her hand paused. Not because she doubted the data, because each verified line had once belonged to someone asking for help in a voice so quiet she had to lean into the receiver to hear them. At 7:04, a marshal stepped out and called roll for witness staging. Grace answered, voice low but stable. He checked her ID twice, then directed her to a side waiting room with 2 plastic chairs, a humming vending machine, and a narrow window clouded by rain. She sat and set her briefcase on her knees as if it were armor. The fluorescent light overhead flickered at irregular intervals, a pulse that made her temples throb. She took 2 ibuprofen from a tin in her bag and swallowed them dry. Her throat scraped. She tried to rehearse simple facts, no adjectives, no interpretation. On March 18th, invoice batch C-14 was mistranslated at source and corrected in supplemental filing. On April 2nd, payment cleared through 3 intermediaries before landing in a shell account tied to Rivergate Holdings. On April 11th, legal harassment funding moved from a trust with no declared beneficiary. Facts had weight. Facts were safer than memory. But memory intruded anyway. Her ex-partner's lawyers smirking across a conference table while demanding she sign affidavits she knew were false. The threat dressed as advice. The fee schedule she could not challenge because she had no resources left to fight every procedural cut. At 7:19, her sister texted from Queens, "Did you eat anything?" Grace typed yes, then deleted it and wrote, "Half a bar, don't worry." She added a heart because omission caused more anxiety than honesty in her family, and anxiety had already been expensive. A second text came back immediately, "I can transfer 40. Grace stared at the words until they blurred. Her sister had 2 children and a part-time job with irregular hours. $40 was groceries, not generosity. Grace typed no, then thank you, then finally keep it. I'll manage. She locked the screen before another offer could arrive. She leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes for 6 breaths. counting in Mandarin because it slowed her pulse. The room was not quiet. It held distant footsteps, elevator chimes, courthouse doors opening and sealing shut. Yet inside that noise, she felt the old isolation that came when survival reduced life to transactions. Hours for rent, certainty for compliance, dignity for access. She had spent months pretending this testimony was only civic duty, only procedural obligation. The truth was harder. She was here because silence had already cost too much, and because every time she considered withdrawing, she pictured the women whose statements had come to her in fragments between static and tears, trusting that someone on the other end would not erase them. At 7:31, a court officer opened the waiting room door and called her name. Grace stood too quickly, the edge of vision narrowing for a second before the floor steadied beneath her feet. She smoothed the damp lapel of her blazer, lifted her briefcase, and followed him into the corridor, where marble reflected cold morning light in fractured bands. Through the high windows, rain continued to fall over lower Manhattan without pause, relentless and ordinary, as she walked toward courtroom 4B and the witness stand that waited like a clean blade. The courtroom doors opened on hydraulic hinges with a hush that swallowed corridor noise, and Grace stepped in behind the court officer with rain still damp on her cuffs and the sour taste of cold coffee sitting at the back of her tongue. Courtroom 4B looked less like justice than architecture performing certainty. Polished wood, brass rails, high windows beaded with weather, flags pressed flat and still in the stale heat. The gallery was already filling. Junior associates with legal pads and sharpened posture took the left benches. Reporters with expensive cameras and impatient eyes lined the right. Two older women in housekeeping uniforms sat near the back, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched. Grace recognized one of them from an affidavit transcript. The woman did not wave, did not smile, just held Grace's gaze for 1 second and lowered her eyes to her lap. "Fact witness, right side," the officer murmured. Grace moved to the witness area and set her briefcase down by her ankles. The heel that had taken on water made her stance subtly uneven, and she shifted weight until the ache in her lower back settled into a manageable line. At counsel table, Victor Sava's legal team arranged itself with practiced choreography. 4 attorneys, matching charcoal suits, legal tabs in identical colors, each movement quiet and synchronized. Sava sat between lead counsel and an investigator, wrists free, expression composed, silver tie centered with surgical precision. He looked like a donor at a museum benefit, not a man named in trafficking counts and intimidation complaints. When his eyes landed on her, his smile arrived right on time. Warm enough for cameras, empty enough to chill skin. A court clerk approached with a tablet and a stack of forms. She was efficient in the way of someone handling too many tasks and too many people before 9 in the morning. Name for the record confirmation? Grace Lynn Chen. The clerk scanned the screen and then looked up. "You're the interpreter from intake?" "Translator," Grace said. "And yes." The clerk's brows lifted a fraction. "So we should request language accommodation if counsel has trouble." The nearest reporter glanced over at the word trouble. Grace felt heat rise up her neck. "My testimony is in English." "Of course," the clerk said, voice flattening, not apologizing. She tapped another field. "State your highest credential exactly as shown, slowly." Grace did, careful with each syllable while 2 cameras tilted toward her and the lead defense attorney pretended not to listen. It was a small humiliation, procedural on paper, public in practice, and it lodged under her ribs anyway. She signed where indicated, returned the stylus, and heard one of Sava's associates murmur something that ended in accent exposure, followed by a soft laugh quickly hidden behind a cough. At 7:46, the judge entered, and everyone rose. The formalities moved fast: appearances, docket number, admonitions, sequencing. Grace listened, pulled from fatigue into alertness by necessity. When the prosecution called her, she walked to the stand with her shoulders locked and her fingertips numb. She swore, sat, adjusted the microphone once, and folded her hands to keep from fidgeting. The prosecutor's questions were direct. Name, occupation, contracted role in multilingual document processing across civil and criminal proceedings, scope of involvement in records linked to Sava Hospitality Group and affiliated entities. Grace answered with clipped precision, each sentence measured to fact. She identified invoice sets, transfer trails, corrected translations, shell company aliases. Her pulse pounded hard enough that she felt it at the base of her throat, but her voice held. She described how the same holding companies appeared under different names in licensing applications, how staffing manifests and vendor contracts were backdated, how one batch of concierge placement records was coded to conceal coercive debt terms and passport seizure. She named dates the way one places stones across a river. "Did you ever alter any underlying data?" the prosecutor asked. "No." "Did anyone ask you to?" "Yes." "Who?" "Counsel retained by my former partner, funded through accounts linked to Rivergate Holdings." A stir went through the gallery. Pens moving, shoes shifting, the brittle crackle of attention sharpening. Grace kept her eyes on the prosecutor's shoulder, not on Sava, not on the reporters. The judge instructed the room to maintain order without raising his voice. The words carried anyway. Cross-examination came like polished teeth. Sava's lead attorney rose with a sympathetic smile and the cadence of someone who billed by precision. He praised Grace's work ethic, then began to chip at framing. Was she overworked during document review? Yes. Could fatigue affect memory? It could, which was why she relied on logged records. Did she harbor personal resentment toward parties connected to her former domestic litigation? Objection sustained. He pivoted, gentler and sharper at once. "Ms. Chen, would you agree that translation involves interpretation?" "In language nuance, yes. And nuance can alter meaning. It can clarify meaning. In your accent and phrasing, regional variation may produce misunderstanding in legal contexts, correct?" The question was dressed as technical concern and landed as public diminishment. Grace felt the old reflex to shrink, to answer softly so men like him could feel generous while pressing down. She did not shrink. "My certifications are current, my transcripts are peer-reviewed, and my corrections are documented in writing. If you are implying incompetence, say it directly." A few heads turned. The attorney's jaw tightened for a beat before he smiled again. "No implication, Ms. Chen. Only caution." From the bench, the judge said, "Counsel, move on." The attorney moved on to Pier 39, to loading manifests, to whether she had physically visited the dock. She had not. She had translated logs and matched them with camera timestamps and customs entries. He tried to drag her into speculation. She stayed inside record boundaries. By 8:18 a.m., rain was striking the high windows hard enough to sound like handfuls of gravel, and the courtroom lights flickered once before stabilizing. It was during a pause for document retrieval that Grace allowed herself one glance toward the back rows. A man in a dark suit sat alone near the aisle, posture still, hands resting loosely on his knees. Matteo Belandi was impossible to mistake, even for someone who had only seen him in court security briefings and business page photographs half whispered over in staff lounges. Tailored black wool, no visible impatience, dark eyes that seemed to map exits without moving. Around him, people kept an extra seat's worth of distance without being told. He was not on the witness list and not at counsel table. He was simply there, watching, room silencing in the way of weather systems and loaded weapons. Grace looked away first, unsettled less by his reputation than by the steadiness of his attention. She had spent years being overlooked until she became useful, then targeted for that usefulness. Being seen that completely felt dangerous in a different register. At recess, the bailiff announced 10 minutes. The room exhaled at once. Lawyers huddling, reporters calling desks, chairs scraping against wood. Grace stepped down carefully, knees unsteady from adrenaline and hunger. She reached for her briefcase, found that her fingers were trembling, and clenched them around the handle until the shaking eased. In the aisle, 2 young associates in tailored navy brushed past her without eye contact, one muttering, "Media likes a martyr," not quite under his breath. Near the rail, Sava's investigator held a door for an older jurist with impeccable manners while letting it swing shut just before Grace reached it. The edge clipped her sleeve and jolted her shoulder. "Sorry," he said, smiling in a way that had no remorse in it. Grace said nothing. Saying nothing often preserved energy. Today, it preserved control. The hallway outside 4B was brighter than the courtroom and somehow colder. Courthouse staff clustered around a coffee cart, voices low. A reporter tried to intercept Grace with a recorder and got blocked by a marshal. "No hallway comments," he said, one palm up, not touching anyone. Grace nodded gratitude and kept moving. Her throat felt scraped raw and she needed water. Quiet, 2 minutes without being observed. She turned toward the judge's entrance corridor because she knew from previous assignments there was a service alcove with a fountain and an old radiator that sometimes worked. The farther she went, the thinner the crowd became. The floor changed from polished marble to matte tile. Fluorescents hummed overhead. A fire door at the end of the hall stood half-latched. Paint bubbled near the base from old water damage. She heard rain drumming on some unseen exterior awning, and, beneath it, the creak of a cartwheel. A valet in courthouse livery stood near the judge's side doors, sorting key tags on a metal ring. Grace had seen him before on early calendars, always brisk, always neat. Today his hands shook hard enough that keys slipped and struck the floor with bright, anxious clinks. He bent to retrieve them, dropped them again, then laughed too quickly at nothing at all. His collar was damp despite being indoors. "You okay?" Grace asked before she could stop herself. He looked up as if startled to find her there. "Fine. Long morning." His smile was thin and gone in a second. On his belt, a small radio crackled with static, then cut out. He tapped it twice, frowned, turned the knob. Nothing. From farther down, another bailiff spoke into his own unit, voice clipped. "Channel 3 dead again. Repeat, Channel 3 is off." The transmission dissolved into hiss. Grace's skin prickled along her forearms. Equipment failed in old buildings, yes. Rain interfered, yes. But the timing pressed at her nerves in a way she could not reason down. She crossed to the fountain, ran water until it turned cold, cupped one hand, drank, then splashed her wrists. Her pulse was too fast. She counted backward in Mandarin, set her briefcase on the ledge, inhaled slowly until the tunnel at the edges of her vision widened. The corridor behind her had gone quiet. Not empty. Quiet. The kind that arrived when people stopped moving at the same time. She straightened and listened. No cartwheel now, no clerk chatter. Just the thud of rain and the electric buzz of lights. Then footsteps approached from the far side of the fire door, measured, unhurried, leather sole on concrete. They stopped directly on the other side of the seam. Grace did not move. Her mouth went dry so fast it hurt. For a heartbeat, there was only weather and fluorescent hum. Then a man's voice came through the narrow crack, low and almost amused, pitched as if delivering a private courtesy. Witnesses who forget things live longer. Thunder rolled over the building, heavy enough to vibrate the metal doorframe, and every light in the corridor flickered once. The fluorescent tube steadied, buzzing back to full strength as if nothing had happened. Grace kept her hand on the metal ledge by the fountain because her knees had gone untrustworthy, and through the fire door she heard a soft scuff, then silence, then retreating steps that did not hurry. Whoever had spoken knew he had been heard. That was the point. She took one breath, then another, and reached for her phone. No signal in the corridor. One bar appeared, vanished, returned. She opened her contact log out of habit, thumb hovering over the Marshal liaison number she had been told to use for threats. But a courthouse page echoed down the hall before she could hit call. Recess is over for 4B. Witnesses back inside. A court officer rounded the corner and slowed when he saw her face. "Ms. Chen, you all right?" She swallowed. Her throat burned. "Someone was at that door," he said. She stopped because repeating the line felt like signing a contract she did not want. "He threatened me." The officer's expression tightened, procedural caution sliding into place. "Did you see him?" "No, I heard him." Male voice, right there. He glanced at the fire door seam, then at her briefcase, then back to her. "Stay with me. I'll flag it." "Not I believe you. Not I heard him too. Flag it. Process language." Grace nodded anyway and forced her feet into motion beside him. At the judge's side corridor, the valet was gone. Only a ring of keys sat on the cart, one brass tag still swinging as if set down too fast. When they re-entered the main hallway, sound hit like pressure. Reporters speaking into phones, case names shouted between clerks, shoes striking marble in sharp, expensive rhythms. Grace felt stripped, as if the private threat had followed her into fluorescent public light, and now hovered just above shoulder height, where no camera could catch it. She leaned toward the officer while they walked. "Please report Channel 3. A bailiff said it was dead." He nodded once. "I heard. It is on it." Not enough, she thought, and kept walking. Inside 4B, the judge had not yet returned. Lawyers stood in clusters around counsel tables. Victor Sava remained seated, one arm draped over the back of his chair, speaking quietly to lead counsel as if they were discussing a fundraising menu rather than witness intimidation in a federal proceeding. His smile arrived when he saw her, faint and practiced, and Grace looked away before it could settle under her skin. She took her seat near the witness rail and slid her phone into her lap under the table. Screen dimmed. At 8:27 a.m., the minute indicator flipped while she watched, and the small movement of digital time felt absurdly fragile against the machinery around her. She opened a draft message addressed to Mina Ortiz, the investigative journalist who had spent 6 months corroborating trafficking records and who had once told Grace in a diner that smelled like bleach and burnt coffee, "If they pressure you, don't wait for perfect proof. Send the code. I'll know what it means." Grace typed nothing yet. Just checked that the preloaded archive remained attached in encrypted form. Translation logs, ledger photos, shell company crosswalks, the corrected peer manifests with metadata, 3 mirrored upload links and release instructions if she missed 2 check-ins. Her fingers shook once, hard, then steadied. The judge returned. Proceedings resumed. Cross picked up where it had paused, with defense counsel in smooth cadence and careful traps. Grace answered in factual lines, refusing invitation after invitation to speculate. Her throat still burned from the corridor threat. and now adrenaline sharpened every sound. Pen taps, chair creaks, the low hum of camera batteries charging in the media row. Twice she saw Matteo Belandi in her peripheral vision at the back bench, unmoving, attention fixed not on Sava, but on the room's moving edges. Doors, aisles, side exits, hands. At 8:41, defense requested a brief sidebar. At 8:44, the judge granted a 6-minute administrative pause for document retrieval and allowed Sava a supervised hall movement with counsel and marshals. The moment the words left the bench, Grace felt her pulse spike so abruptly it made her vision grainy. A marshal approached the witness rail. "Miss Chen, remain seated or stay with officer escort." "I need air," she said. "You can stand by the inner wall. Do not enter public corridor alone." She nodded and rose, knees tight. The air inside the courtroom had gone stale and warm. Outside, the hallway carried drafty cold from every opening door. She took 3 steps toward the interior marble column nearest 4B and kept one hand on her briefcase handle. Reporters drifted like birds toward movement. A camera operator adjusted focus. 2 associates whispered by the water station, eyes flicking to her and away. Then Sava emerged from the side door with 1 marshal at his left, counsel on his right, and 2 private security men a pace behind despite the posted restriction. He walked without hurry, polished shoes, silver tie, cuffed confidence. His gaze found Grace before anyone else in the hallway seemed to understand he was looking. "You look tired, Miss Chen," he said, volume pitched for courtesy and microphones both. People break when they're hungry. The nearest boom mic angled toward them instantly. Grace felt the words land as a hand at the back of her neck. She did not answer. She shifted 1 step closer to the column, creating space that should have been enough. It was not. One of the private men veered as if avoiding a passing clerk and clipped Grace's shoulder with hard, deliberate force. Bone hit stone. Her briefcase slammed the floor and burst open, papers skidding across marble in white fans. The impact drove breath out of her chest so fast she could not inhale for a full second. Light fractured. Sound narrowed to a high electrical ring. "Watch where you're standing," the man said, already turning away. Someone shouted. A marshal moved toward the contact point. Reporters surged, shoes scraping, cameras rising. Grace pressed her palm to the cold column and fought for air while her body tried to fold. In that exact lurching moment, while the hallway tilted and every survival instinct urged her to make herself smaller, she dropped to 1 knee as if to gather papers and pulled her phone from inside her blazer. Thumbprint, unlock, message thread, 1 line, prearranged, lantern red, send. A second tap opened the encrypted archive panel. She hit release all, then confirm. The upload spinner flashed to life on Courthouse Wi-Fi, stalled at 12%, jumped to 60%, then completed with a quiet vibration that felt louder than thunder. 3 auto-schedules armed themselves across mirrored servers. She added 1 final attachment, today's threat note from her log, time-stamped 8:20, and sent it too. Her phone buzzed again, almost immediately. Mina Ortiz. Received. Publishing corroborated set now. Stay visible. Grace exhaled shakily through clenched teeth and shoved the phone back into her pocket as footsteps closed around her from 3 directions. The hallway had changed texture in less than 10 seconds. Reporters' devices began chiming with incoming alerts. A producer at the end of the corridor looked down at his screen, swore under his breath, and started dictating into an earpiece. A junior federal attorney stopped mid-stride, reading fast, face draining of color. "Miss Chen, are you injured?" a marshal asked, crouching. "I can stand." She tried. Pain flared through her shoulder and upper neck. I'm fine. She was not fine. Her hands would not stop trembling, and there was a sharp, hot line under her collarbone where muscle had seized. But she stood anyway, one palm still on the column, and looked toward Sava. His expression had shifted by a degree so small most people would miss it. The smile remained, the eyes did not. Accident in a crowded hall, he said lightly to no one and everyone. Surely we can proceed without theater. The sentence was still hanging in the air when the back doors opened and Matteo Belandi moved into the corridor with his security chief half a step behind him. He did not raise his voice. He did not run. Yet people cleared from his path in a widening arc, as if authority had mass and momentum. Grace registered details in shards. Tailored black coat darkened at the cuffs by rain. Dark gaze cutting once to her shoulder, then to the spread papers, then to Sava's private men, jaw set tight enough to carve language from stone. When he spoke, his voice was low and barely contained. Lock down all exits. His chief answered instantly. Yes, sir. Pull courthouse CCTV to my line and marshal command. Last 20 minutes, all service corridors. On it. Medic now. He stepped between Grace and Sava's detail before anyone could dispute positioning. One hand lifted slightly, not touching her, creating a physical boundary that read like steel. No one touches Miss Chen, he said. Federal marshals were already moving, galvanized by the media alert storm hitting every phone in the building and by the visual clarity of what had just happened. Separate parties. One barked into a radio. I want defense detail against the wall. IDs now. Another marshal pointed at Sava's second private man. Hands where I can see them. Do it. Sava's counsel protested at once. This is improper. My client is authorized. Your client is now a potential witness tampering subject in an active corridor incident. The senior marshal cut in. You can argue in front of the judge. Reporters pressed forward until a line of deputies forced them back. No filming this lane, one deputy ordered. Move. Grace's knees threatened to give way again. Matteo turned his head just enough to address her without taking his eyes fully off the threat field. Stay behind me, he said, clipped and absolute. Do you understand me? She hated that relief could feel like surrender. She hated more that her body answered before her pride did. Yes. His security chief returned with an earpiece pressed tight. Feeds are coming through. Service corridor camera by judge's entrance was looped for 90 seconds. We have partial of a male approaching fire door before the loop. Grace felt cold spread through her abdomen, precise and heavy. Not paranoia, not fatigue distortion. A looped camera and a voice through metal. Matteo's gaze hardened. Flag the frame. Circulate to marshals and court security only. No public release. A trauma physician arrived with a rolling kit, flanked by 2 women officers in plain clothes. Matteo gestured without looking away from Sava. Assess her here, then move her to secured conference room. Women only on close post. Understood, one officer said. Across the corridor, Sava tilted his head, smile returning with deliberate calm. Mr. Belandi, he said, polite as polished glass. You appear invested. Matteo did not answer him. He addressed the senior marshal instead. Document this as attempted intimidation tied to an active federal witness. I want chain of custody on every camera file and every seized device in this hallway. The marshal gave one tight nod. You'll get process, not favors. Process is all I asked for. Grace watched Sava watch Matteo, and for the first time that morning she saw uncertainty flicker across the polished facade. Brief, controlled, but real. Around them, radios that had been dead minutes earlier crackled back to life on restored channels, voices overlapping in clipped code. Doors at both corridor ends sealed under temporary lockdown protocol with heavy magnetic clicks. The physician touched Grace's wrist, checking pulse. "Ms. Chen, look at me. Any head strike? Shoulder, column. Dizziness? Yes. Better now. We're moving you." As the women officers closed in at her sides and the hallway reorganized into lines of command, evidence bags, and legal objections, Grace bent once to retrieve the one sheet that had landed face up near her shoe. Pier 39, Manifest Correction. Highlighted in yellow, raindrop stain dried into the margin from the morning commute. She slid it back into her briefcase with careful fingers. When she straightened, Mateo had already shifted half a step to keep himself between her and every open angle in the corridor. And the storm outside hit the courthouse windows with a force that sounded like fists. The storm outside hit the courthouse windows with a force that sounded like fists. And Grace moved with the two women officers through a corridor that had turned from public space into controlled perimeter in less than a minute. One officer kept a hand near Grace's elbow without gripping her. The other walked half a step ahead, scanning door handles, side halls, ceiling corners, the mirrored panel near the service elevator where anyone could hide and watch. Behind them, Mateo's voice carried in clipped directives that never rose but cut through radio traffic anyway. "Close judges access on level 4. I want hard badges only." A pause, then, "No exceptions. If they argue, call me." Another pause. "Pull the valet for statement and keep him separate from defense teams." Grace tried not to look back, but she caught one image over her shoulder before the officers turned her through a side door. Mateo standing broadside to the corridor, coat unbuttoned, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a phone to his ear. As if he had been built for moments when systems failed and someone had to force them to work. The judge's conference room had a heavy oak table, 12 leather chairs, 2 muted landscape prints, and no windows. It smelled faintly of furniture polish and stale heat from a radiator that clicked every 30 seconds. One officer shut the door and checked the latch twice. The other swept the room with practiced efficiency, opening the supply closet, checking beneath the table, then nodding once to the physician who arrived seconds later with a compact trauma kit. "I'm Dr. Halpern," he said, already snapping on gloves. "I need your eyes on me, Miss Chen. Any blackout?" "No." "Nausea?" "A little." "Head strike?" "Shoulder into column." Neck snapped back. He tested pupil response, tracked her gaze left and right, palpated along her collarbone and scapula with quick, careful pressure. Pain flared when his fingers reached the top of her shoulder. Grace hissed and turned away. "Muscle trauma, likely contusion," he said. "No obvious fracture, but I want imaging if dizziness persists more than an hour. You're trembling. Have you eaten?" She shook her head. "Then we solve that now." The door opened again, and a staff aide entered carrying a tray that looked misplaced in a crisis. 2 bowls of clear broth, sliced bread, fruit, electrolyte packets, bottled water, napkins folded into neat triangles. Behind him came a court clerk with a small garment bag and a cardboard shoebox. Grace stared at the box in confusion until the clerk set it down and said, almost apologetic, "Your shoes were saturated. We got your size from HR intake. Neutral flats." Grace looked at the plain black flats as if they were luxury goods. Her soaked heel had been silently bleeding heat from her body for hours. She sat down because her knees gave out at the thought of dry feet. When Mateo entered 2 minutes later, he did not sit. He stood at the end of the table, phone in hand, listening to someone on speaker while watching Grace's breathing settle into something steadier. "Your Honor," he said into the phone, voice formal, Witness transfer is a tampering vector now. Keep her in this room or in open court only. My team will coordinate with marshals, but chain of command stays with the court. A tinny voice replied from speaker, too low for Grace to catch every word, but she heard documented incident, limited movement, and approved. Thank you, Mateo said, ended the call, and turned to the women officers. Post one at this door, one at the side hall junction. No male staff entry without verbal clearance from Ms. Chen and Marshal Lead. Food and medical only. Yes, sir, the taller officer answered. He faced Grace then, expression unreadable except for the tightness in his jaw. Your briefcase papers were recovered, nothing missing. Marshals logged each page and returned originals. Your phone stays with you. If anyone requests it, you decline until federal counsel arrives. Grace nodded once, then again as the words settled. Control words, action words. No false comfort and no wasted syllables. By 9:10 a.m., the rain had shifted from hard pounding to a steady hiss, and the conference room had acquired a routine that felt strange but survivable. Dr. Halpern applied a cold pack and left oral pain medication with instructions. The officers rotated every 20 minutes without chatter. A marshal lieutenant entered, gave Grace an incident form, watched while she wrote exactly what she heard at the fire door, and took the signed statement in a sealed evidence envelope. When she finished half a bowl of broth, the cramping in her stomach eased enough for her hands to stop shaking. Mateo stayed near the far wall on calls that seemed to braid together courthouse protocol, private security discipline, and federal procedure without crossing legal lines. Grace listened despite herself. Your men do not touch seized devices, he said to someone. Observe only. Marshals collect. A beat. I said observe. Another beat. If you can't follow that, leave the building. Later. Yes, I know who his attorney is. I do not care. No access to level 4. He ended that call and caught Grace watching him. For a second she saw fatigue under the control, a thin gray shadow beneath his eyes that cameras never showed. He crossed to the table and set down a printed sheet. Media push from Ortiz, he said. Your release triggered 3 corroborations inside 20 minutes. Federal prosecutors moved for immediate expansion on intimidation counts. Grace looked at the headline and saw her own encrypted file names reduced to clean public language. Logistics Archive, Shell Ledger Map, Witness Protection Concerns. The coded world she had lived in for months was now visible enough that it could not be quietly erased. She answered fast, Grace said. She was waiting for your signal. Grace swallowed a pain pill with water and leaned back, shoulder throbbing less sharply now. I keep thinking I should have sent it earlier. You sent it when it had maximum leverage, Mateo said. That was strategy, not delay. No praise, no softness, just assessment. Accurate enough that her throat tightened for a different reason. A knock sounded, 3 short raps. The officer at the door checked peephole, opened 6 inches, and admitted the senior marshal. His face was set in the neutral expression people wear when they are trying to keep facts ahead of anger. Status update, he said. We reviewed camera loops. Deliberate feed interruption confirmed. IT traced interference to a portable injector. We're canvassing entries. He looked to Grace. Your threat statement is logged. Federal wants you available for supplemental in 1 hour, in this room. He shifted to Mateo. And Belandi, your request for shared monitor access is denied. You'll get official clips through council channels. Mateo inclined his head once. Understood, Ladis. The marshal held his gaze for a beat longer, then said, Appreciate your people not contaminating scenes. I gave that order. You did. After he left, Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The exchange had no warmth, and yet carried respect earned through restraint, not fear. In her experience, men with power usually reached for theatrics first. Mateo had reached for process and perimeter. The door closed again. Quiet returned, except for rain and radiator clicks. Grace changed into the dry flats and flexed her toes against warmth. The relief was so immediate, it almost hurt. She rubbed a thumb along the cracked edge of her briefcase and said, without looking up, "Why are you doing this?" Mateo took a second before answering. Because witness intimidation in a federal courthouse is a line. Because Sava crossed it in public and expected no consequence. He paused. And because you stood in open court and gave facts when most people would choose silence. That matters. It matters to your case against him. It matters beyond my case. She looked up then, searching for manipulation and finding discipline instead. That should have comforted her. It unsettled her more. The next hour passed in controlled fragments. Supplemental questions from federal counsel, verification of the corridor voice timeline, confirmation that the media release had originated from her device under her own authority. She answered all of it with the same precise cadence she used on the stand, though fatigue began creeping back into her limbs like cold water. At 12:40 p.m., after counsel left and officers rotated again, only Grace and Mateo remained in the room for the first time. The storm had lightened outside, enough that distant traffic noise seeped through old vents. Grace pressed the cold pack against her shoulder and watched Mateo loosen his cuff one notch, then adjust it back as if he regretted the motion. "You were hit," she said quietly. "Not today. Long ago." His eyes flicked to her, guarded. She nodded toward his side, just above the hip, where his jacket had pulled tight earlier when he reached for his phone. She had seen the shape of an old scar line through the shirt, angled and uneven. Knife? For a moment she thought he would ignore the question. Then he took off his jacket, folded it over a chair back, and sat across from her, forearms on his knees, posture still controlled but less ceremonial. 17 years old, he said. My sister was 14. We were leaving school on Mulberry. A man wanted leverage on my father and chose her route home. Grace stayed silent. He grabbed her at a crosswalk. I got between them. The blade caught me instead. Mateo's voice remained level, but each word seemed measured against memory. I bled on a fruit stand while she ran. A vendor hid her in a storage room and called police from the back line. Grace pictured it without wanting to. City noise, a child running, a brother refusing to move. She's alive because strangers made the right choices fast, he said. So when a witness is targeted in a corridor and people hesitate, I do not. The room felt smaller after that. Not from threat, from truth. Grace stared at the table grain until it blurred, then said, My brother died 3 years ago. Mateo did not interrupt. He worked nights at a small restaurant in Flushing. Someone tried to use the loading bay for narcotics transfers. He refused. 2 weeks later, there was a staged robbery. Her voice thinned at the edges. Officially, it stayed unsolved for months. Unofficially, everyone knew whose network touched it. She pressed her thumb hard into the bridge of her nose and kept going because stopping would break rhythm. That was when I started saving everything. Calls, invoices, translation scraps, charity guest lists. If language crossed my desk and it smelled wrong, I copied it. Mateo's gaze did not soften into pity. It sharpened into recognition. You built your own archive, he said. I built it because no one came when we asked nicely. A long silence followed, not empty, just full of weight set down in equal measure. Grace realized her breathing had steadied again. The pain in her shoulder was still there, but it no longer owned the room. A knock broke the moment. The officer opened to the senior marshal, who stepped inside with a sealed evidence bag and a paper inventory sheet. "Update," he said. "Your scattered documents were rechecked against your index. Complete set confirmed." He handed Grace the inventory for signature. Also, unknown male detained near service levels, carrying an unauthorized signal injector. Device is in federal custody. Interview pending. Grace signed with a hand that trembled only once. The marshal turned to Mateo. "Judge approved continued restricted movement for Ms. Chen through end of day. You can station outside this room, not inside, unless she requests." Mateo looked to Grace. She met his eyes and said, "Outside is fine." He nodded. "Outside." When the marshal left, Mateo stood and took his jacket, then paused at the door. "You'll have 2 officers in camera on this entrance. If you need anything, you ask. Not later. Immediately." Grace gave a tired, dry half-smile that surprised her by existing. "Do you always talk like an operations manual?" "Only when it works." He stepped into the hall, and the officer closed the door behind him. Through the thick wood, Grace could hear muted radio checks, the scrape of chair legs, the small mechanical sounds of a perimeter holding. She looked at the signed inventory sheet in front of her, at the evidence number stamped in red, at her own name written in steady letters. For the first time that day, safety felt less like a favor and more like structure, built one instruction at a time. The radiator clicked again, a dry metallic sound that marked the room like a metronome. And Grace stayed seated with the inventory sheet under her palm until the ink fully dried. Her shoulder throbbed in a slow pulse that matched her heartbeat. Less sharp than an hour ago, but deeper now, as if the impact had settled into muscle and claimed territory. Through the conference room door came muted radio chatter, a man's low voice giving numbers, then silence, then the scrape of a shoe on tile. "Structure," she told herself. "Procedure. Locked doors, documented chain of custody, officers rotating on schedule." Her body did not care. Her body still expected the next hand at her back. A soft knock sounded. Officer Reyes opened the door a few inches, listened, then looked to Grace. "Miss Chen, Mr. Belandi is requesting entry for 2 minutes. Your choice." The phrasing mattered. Your choice. Grace nodded once. "Let him in." Mateo stepped inside, and the room seemed to narrow around his presence. Not because he moved quickly, but because he moved with the certainty of someone who never wasted a step. Rain had darkened the shoulders of his jacket again. He closed the door behind him, but did not advance until she gestured toward the chair across from her. "They found the source of the dead channel," he said. "Portable injector and a maintenance tote. The man carrying it is in federal custody. He asked for counsel immediately." Grace watched his face for hints of performance and found only controlled fatigue. Was he one of Sava's regular detail? No. Contract face, disposable. His jaw tightened. His burner had a draft message with your name and a floor map of this courthouse. The words landed like ice water down her spine. She pressed her thumb to the edge of the evidence sheet until the paper bent. So, it wasn't just hallway pressure. No. He held her gaze. It was a plan. For a moment she hated him for being right, hated the calm delivery, hated that his world spoke this language fluently, while hers had learned it through harm. Then her phone buzzed on the table. Mina Ortiz. Grace opened the message with stiff fingers. Published full packet and correction memo. U.S. Attorney just acknowledged receipt on record. Also, Your sister contacted me through secure line. She asked if you were alive. I told her only that you're under official protection. Grace exhaled and typed back. She deserves a direct message from me. Give me 10 minutes. Mina replied with a thumbs up and a location pin for a secure call desk on the same floor, now cleared by marshals. External contact resolved. One less loose wire. When Grace looked up, Matteo was still watching her. Expression unreadable except for the strain at the corners of his mouth. You should make that call, he said. Reyes will take you. She nodded, then asked the question that had been pressing against her ribs since he stepped between her and Sava in the hallway. If I say I don't want your men near my family, does that stand? His answer came without delay. Yes, if federal coverage is sufficient. If it isn't? Then I ask again with evidence, not pressure. The room went very quiet. Rain softened outside, thinning to a hiss against old glass somewhere beyond the corridor walls. Grace felt the pull she had been resisting all day, that dangerous coexistence of relief and suspicion. She trusted his logistics. She did not trust what his power represented. Both truths sat in her chest and refused to sort themselves. You give orders like oxygen, she said. Everyone moves. Doors close, people stop talking. I should be afraid of that. You are afraid of it. I am. Her voice roughened. And I'm still calmer when you're in the hall. His eyes shifted just slightly, as if the honesty hit harder than accusation. You can use what I can provide without owing me anything. Grace let out a short, tired breath that almost became a laugh and didn't. That sounds clean. None of this is clean. No, he said. It isn't. By 1:17 p.m., after a secured call with her sister that ended in tears, both of them pretended were from bad reception. Grace returned to the conference room with fresh ice on her shoulder and a new summons from federal counsel. Redirect testimony would resume in courtroom 4B in 22 minutes. The timing line steadied her. Minutes could be counted. Decisions could be sequenced. Officer Reyes checked her badge, her phone, and the corridor cam feed on a tablet before opening the door. Matteo waited outside near the junction, speaking quietly to the marshal lieutenant. They stopped when Grace approached. The lieutenant addressed her first. Movement protocol. 2 deputies front, 2 rear. Ms. Reyes at your side. No pauses in open hall. If anyone attempts contact, keep walking. Understood? Understood. Matteo's gaze moved to her shoulder, then back to her eyes. Stay on my left in the stairwell. Camera blind spot on landing 3 has been patched, but I don't like the angle. The lieutenant gave him a look that might have been irritation in another man, then nodded once. He's right about that angle. They moved. The courthouse felt different now, not because it had become safer, but because danger had been named and mapped. Deputies held doors in advance. Clerks flattened against walls to clear transit. Radios stayed alive on all channels, repeating position checks every 30 seconds. Grace heard her own shoes. Dry, soft-soled, silent compared with the old heels. Moving over tile, then marble, then the brass threshold into 4B. Inside, the courtroom air had turned warmer, crowded with waiting bodies and fresh attention. Reporters packed the back rows, screens lit with the headlines she had triggered. Sava sat at counsel table with an expression composed enough to pass for boredom. His eyes gave him away. When Grace entered under escort, his smile came back like a switch thrown in a dark room. Redirect began immediately. Federal counsel walked her through the hallway incident, the prior threat at the fire door, and her rationale for releasing the encrypted archive. Grace answered with the same precision that had carried her through the morning. Yes, she heard the voice. Yes, she documented unknown calls. Yes, she activated the release after physical contact in the corridor because she believed witness intimidation had escalated to immediate operational risk. Defense objected twice. The judge overruled both and told counsel to reserve argument for briefing. Then came cross-recapture, and Sava leaned toward his attorney to murmur something with a smile. The attorney stood, buttoned his jacket, and approached with curated sympathy. "Miss Chen, you've had quite a dramatic day," he said. "Would you agree heightened emotion can affect perception?" "No. No effect at all? I rely on records and timestamps. Emotion doesn't alter metadata." A few pens in the gallery paused, then resumed. The attorney pivoted, voice almost gentle. "You received extraordinary attention from Mr. Belandi's organization after this alleged hallway contact." Grace kept her hands folded to hide the tremor returning at her fingertips. "I received documented protection coordinated with marshals. From a rival syndicate principal. From officers posted by court approval." The attorney took one step closer. "And are you now under Mr. Belandi's personal control in exchange for that protection?" The question hit the room like a dropped glass. Even the HVAC hum seemed to recede. Grace felt the old humiliation rise, that familiar public framing that reduced women to possession or deceit. No third option offered. She lifted her chin and answered before counsel could decorate the silence. "I belong to no man," she said, clear and formal. "Not to Victor Sava when he financed legal threats through shell accounts, and not to Mr. Belandi now. I am here under subpoena and under law. Your client's enterprises were built on coerced silence. Mine is a sworn statement." Sava's smile thinned. He spoke without waiting for his attorney, voice carrying just far enough. "Careful, Miss Chen. Men like him don't guard doors for free." The prosecutor was already rising, but Grace spoke first again, eyes on Sava this time. "Men like you confuse intimidation with value. That has always been your mistake." "Order," the judge snapped. "Mr. Sava, one more outburst and you lose hallway privileges." At the back of the courtroom, Mateo stood. He did not ask permission to be heard. He addressed the bench in the tone of a man placing a fact on record. "Your Honor, with respect, let the record reflect that any threat directed at this witness will be answered through lawful channels, immediately and in full coordination with federal authority." His voice stayed low, barely contained, each word deliberate. "He threatens her again, and every legal mechanism in this city will find me standing beside her statement." Defense counsel objected at once. "Improper grandstanding." The judge held up a hand. "Noted and useful. Sit down, Mr. Belandi." Mateo sat. The moral line in the room became visible after that. Not abstract, not rhetorical. Deputies repositioned closer to Sava's table. The marshal at the side door moved his stance to block direct sightline to Grace's exit path. Federal counsel introduced the seized draft message from the detained injector carrier and tied its timestamp to the channel outage and corridor movement window. Defense requested exclusion. Denied. Prosecutors added the restored camera clip showing the approach to the fire door. Admitted for limited purpose pending authentication hearing. Every piece clicked into place, with the cold rhythm of process doing its job. By the time the judge called a recess to prepare remand argument, Sava's composure had developed small fractures. A jaw flex, a finger drumming too fast on polished wood, a glance toward his second chair that no longer held a private operative. Grace stepped down from the stand on steady legs that didn't feel steady, and Officer Reyes guided her toward the secured side exit. At the threshold, Sava spoke once more, quieter now, aimed like a blade. "Protection expires." Grace stopped just long enough to turn her head. So does impunity. She kept walking. Behind her, she heard the judge call the room back to order, and the deputy announced that all non-essential movement was suspended pending ruling. Ahead of her, the side corridor door opened to officers, radios, and the disciplined noise of people who had chosen their side in daylight. Grace was guided back into the conference room, where the radiator still clicked and the oak table still held the half-empty water bottle she had left behind, as if the room had refused to move forward until she returned. Officer Reyes secured the door. The marshal lieutenant came in with a legal pad, followed by an assistant U.S. attorney carrying 2 evidence envelopes and a slim laptop case. "We're going straight into remand argument in 20 minutes, the prosecutor said, breathing hard from the pace. "I need you to confirm 3 points for the record package. 1, that the fire door threat occurred at approximately 8:20. 2, that the release command from your device was voluntary and contemporaneous with the hallway contact. 3, that these are your originals." He placed the envelopes on the table. One held her printed subpoena and the Pier 39 correction page she had picked up off the courthouse floor. The other held a photo printout of the burner draft message recovered from the detained injector carrier, her name at the top in block letters, root notes beneath. Grace read each line, then signed where indicated. Her signature was steady this time. Yes, to all 3. The marshal lieutenant slid a 3rd sheet toward her. Outcome on your call log reports. The unknown number voicemails with breathing were routed through the same relay service used by the burner recovered in the stair incident. Forensics tied 2 origin pings to a device purchased by a subcontractor linked to Sava Hospitality Security. This goes in with intimidation pattern. A cold, precise relief moved through her chest. The calls had been real, not just fatigue in the dark. "Thank you." Before he could answer, there was a knock. Reyes checked, then admitted a thin man in courthouse valet livery, flanked by another deputy. The man's hand still trembled, though less violently than before. He kept his eyes down until the lieutenant said, "She should hear this from you." The valet swallowed. "Ms. Chen, I'm Luis Ferran. I work at judge's entrance mornings." His voice cracked on the second sentence. "A man in a maintenance jacket approached me before recess, said Channel 3 was having scheduled interference, and handed me cash to leave the key cart by the side door for facility access. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway." He rubbed his palms against his pants. When the lights flickered, I realized what I'd done. I tried to call it in, and my radio was dead. Grace watched him, remembering the brass tag striking tile, the damp collar, the thin smile that vanished too quickly. "Did you hear the man speak at the fire door?" "No. I only saw him approach with a tote and stop there." Luis looked up, eyes rimmed red. "I gave statement and camera placement. I forfeited the cash. I'm under internal review. I'm sorry." The apology landed awkwardly, but it landed. Grace nodded once. "Say that same thing under oath if they ask." "I will." By 2:03 p.m., rain had thinned to mist over Lafayette Street, and courtroom 4B was full again. This time the stillness carried a different weight. Prosecutors moved first, methodical and unsparing. They entered Grace's released archive with authentication logs, the recovered injector, the burner draft naming her and listing jury residential blocks, the restored camera clip of the fire door approach, and the financial transfer chain connecting intimidation expenses to a shell account already tied to Sava's enterprise. They added Luis Ferran's signed statement and forensic notation on channel disruption. Defense objected in waves. The judge denied most, reserved 2 for later briefing, and kept listening. When the assistant U.S. attorney finished, The courtroom held one suspended second of silence. Then the judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Sava. This court finds clear and convincing evidence of witness intimidation, operational planning to interfere with judicial process, and ongoing risk to public safety. Remand is ordered. Bail is denied. The words were plain. Their consequence was not. Deputies moved immediately. Sava stood with practiced composure that faltered only at the jaw when the cuffs came out. He turned his head toward Grace once, but the deputy blocked the sight line before anything else could pass between them. The judge continued, voice clipped. Protective orders are granted for identified witnesses and cooperating victims. Federal task force expansion is approved under existing racketeering predicates. Counsel will receive schedule for evidentiary hearings on the added counts. Gavel. Next matter. As Sava was escorted out, Mateo remained seated in the back row, hands still, expression unreadable. He did not look at her until the defendant cleared the side door. When he did, he gave one short nod. Not triumph, not possession, only acknowledgement that a line had held. 3 days passed before Grace returned to the courthouse for the evidentiary intake hearing. And this time, she wore dry shoes she had bought with her first reimbursement check, carried a new briefcase with intact hinges, and walked in under her own pace without feeling the floor tilt. In a secure records office on level 2, she handed over every physical item she had preserved. Annotated translation notebooks, original invoice copies, the old phone containing backup screenshots, the plastic sleeve that had held her subpoena through the rain. The clerk behind the glass verified each item against chain of custody logs and stamped the transfer receipt in red. Anything else to submit? The clerk asked. Grace thought of the cracked heels she had left in a courthouse trash bin the day of the assault. No, that's all. Then this set is complete. She folded the receipt and placed it in her wallet behind her transit card. In the hallway outside records, Mina Ortiz leaned against a vending machine with 2 paper cups of coffee and a press badge turned backward against her coat. One is terrible, one is less terrible, Mina said, offering the cups. I forgot which is which. Grace took one and almost smiled. What happened with the publication holdbacks? Released this morning. Full packet, redactions for survivor privacy only. Mina's expression turned serious. Your quote request is still open. You can approve, edit, or kill it. Read it. Mina pulled out her phone. Silence looks neutral from the outside. On the inside, it is expensive and enforced. Grace let the line sit for a breath. Keep it. Done. Mina slipped the phone away. Also, that clerk from your first day? The one who questioned your credentials in front of cameras? Grace's shoulders tightened. He filed an internal memo claiming he was ensuring procedural clarity. No apology. Grace stared down the corridor, where fluorescent light flattened everyone to the same shade of tired. Then that never resolved. Noted. It resolved before she left the building. At 4:10, the senior marshal met her outside intake with a stamped administrative order and a docket addendum from courtroom 4B. The order sustained a conduct complaint against the intake clerk, imposed a formal reprimand, required mandatory bias and access training, and removed him from witness-facing counters until completion. The addendum entered an on-record correction that Grace Chen appeared as a subpoenaed fact witness with current credentials and no language-based deficiency. She signed receipt, took her copy, and placed it with her case documents. Later that afternoon, Grace met her sister in a supervised family room at a victim services center 2 blocks from court. Her sister hugged her hard enough to press pain through the healing bruise, then pulled back with immediate guilt and a hand to Grace's shoulder. Sorry, I forgot. You're fine, Grace said, and this time she meant it. Her sister's 2 children sat at a coloring table by the window, arguing softly over a green marker and entirely focused on whether dragons should have wings. Safe, loud, ordinary. Grace watched them for a long second and felt the room settle in her body in a way no briefing ever had. By the second week of October, Grace stood at the front of a renovated municipal office suite on Center Street, while a brushed steel plaque was mounted beside the door. Multilingual Witness and Survivor Advocacy Unit. Independent Oversight Panel. Funded through seized criminal assets and court-authorized restitution. The space still smelled like fresh paint and cardboard. And 3 donated desks were lined with boxed headsets, intake forms in 6 languages, and trauma referral binders waiting to be used. The deputy commissioner shook her hand. "You're sure you want this?" Grace looked through the glass at the waiting area where 2 former hospitality workers sat with advocates, speaking quietly in Mandarin and Spanish, while an intake coordinator translated legal options without rushing either of them. Yes. At noon, when the first day's appointments finally slowed, Officer Reyes arrived in plain clothes with a folder of updated protective order maps. "Perimeter checks are stable," she said. "Federal relocation accepted for 4 high-risk witnesses. 2 declined and took monitored housing instead. All acknowledged service." "Thank you," Grace said, and signed the acknowledgement page. When Reyes left, Mateo appeared at the open office doorway. No entourage inside the suite, only 1 security detail stationed discreetly across the hall where building policy allowed. Daylight cut across his dark coat and left a pale line at his cheekbone. He waited until Grace looked up. "I called first," he said. "Front desk approved entry." Grace set down her pen. "You followed protocol." "I was instructed to." She walked him to the hallway alcove where conversation stayed private but visible through glass. "Sava was transferred this morning," she said. "Federal Supermax intake confirmed. I received notice." They stood in a silence that wasn't empty. Through the glass, phones rang, keyboards clicked. Someone laughed once and then lowered their voice for a client call. Real work, not crisis theater. "I can't live inside your world," Grace said quietly. "I won't." Mateo's gaze held hers without flinching. "Then don't. I'm not asking you to. I also won't pretend your protection doesn't matter. Nor will I." She studied him, the controlled posture, the restraint he had chosen again and again when force would have been easier. "Respectful perimeter," she said. "My terms. Daylight. No hidden conditions." His answer came low and immediate. "Agreed." She let out a breath that felt like setting down weight she'd carried for years. "Then we start there." Mateo inclined his head once. "We start there." When he turned to go, he paused and looked back at the unit door, at the new plaque, at the advocates moving through the corridor with case files held to their chests. "Legal backbone," he said, almost to himself. "Harder to break than fear." Grace followed his gaze, then looked past her own reflection in the glass to the guarded entrance downstairs where 2 uniformed officers checked badges with patient, unyielding routine. Safety was still a structure that required maintenance, testimony, signatures, and people willing to stand their post when weather turned and pressure climbed. It was not soft. It was not permanent. It was real. She returned to her desk, opened the first intake file of the afternoon, and began in a clear voice that did not shake.